I won't repeat that one. Yeah. Good. Yeah. This is as usual, I guess. But I guess nowadays the internet engineering is changing, right? I mean, it's we're not inventing anything new really nowadays. It's just adding little things here and there. It's kind of a now cloud, over HTTP stuff, right? It's all over there. I'm kind of hard, maybe. Unless. Right. And there's no innovation. All the association makes that we cannot touch anything. I'm less, I guess, involved. I'm getting involved with sorry? Anima? Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of a challenge. Nice to meet you again. Okay. Yep. Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Casm buff. Casm is spelled from Coordinated Address Space Management. This is a non-forming working group forming buff. Next slide, please. But as usual, we are doing this meeting under the Note 12, which is essentially everything you say or you write is under the provisions of the Note 12 here. Next slide, please. That's a proposed agenda. We have a few documents that have been published over the last months and one over the last year or so. We're going to have a slightly different set of presentations, but roughly following that structure of use case and architecture. Any agenda bashing? Any changes or proposed changes to the agenda? Okay, thank you. Okay, we'll see. Well, Ralph is doing the EV technical work. Do we have note takers? It would be great to have at least one note taker. Very useful for after the meeting and for the people who are not there. Anybody would like to volunteer for note taking? Please.
Oh,
thank you, John.
The notepad, do we have an Etherpad? Can we do it on, as a community effort on the Etherpad?
There was one suggestion to do using Etherpad, but John, are you okay with that, or? Yeah, kind of. Okay. Well, at least we have one.
Okay.
Thank you. While it's not non-working group forming, we put some text on the objectives of this buff taken from the 5434, which is we have to find if we have a problem that needs solving, and that the IETF, there's a right group to attempt solving it, that there's a critical mass of participants willing to work on the problem, that the scope of the problem is well defined, understood, and what are the actual deliverables, the agreement on the specific deliverables, and as a reasonable probability of having success. I'm not sure we will go to the deliverables today, but we'll see how it goes. But I think the first three is appropriate, especially the scope is where we should concentrate our discussions. We have 90 minutes, so we would like to take the kind of a half of the 90, so 45 minutes for the presentations, and then leaving the rest for discussions. And we have a final slide. Over the last few months, I guess, we got some specific questions either on the mailing list or from the ADs. Some are there, so we keep this in mind as we should be trying to answer those. Which interfaces does Casm plan on standardizing? Which lines in the diagram you will see in the architecture presentations get an interface? What are the borders in terms of admin organizations, tenants, and stuff like that? What is the goal of interoperability, and what are the envisioned key deliverables if we go that far? First presentation.
Which is the first one?
Use cases of Casm. So I think it's Dr. Shi.
Use cases. Yeah, that's for this one. Okay, right. Oh, here, you can use this to advance the slides. Right here.
Are you sure?
Hello, everyone. This presentation is about the use case of Casm, coordinated address space management. Since the use case come from multiple sources, so this presentation will be delivered by me in joint with. Okay. It's okay. I will be very close. In joint with Ian of Dutch Telecom and Dr. Mahdi of ZDNS. This gives a list of use cases. The first one is IP address pool configurations for devices and network functions. Sometimes it is virtualized devices and functions. And the second one is about the use cases for net and CGN. CGN means carrier grade net. And the next one is about address configuration through the API of IPAM. And then we talk about its use cases for RPKI. And the last one is about SD and NFA scenarios. The first use case about the IP address pool configurations for network devices, including the virtualized devices. Actually, this use case has been introduced several times since last year. We had demos in BNBs of IETF 95 meetings in Argentina, and we received a lot of comments and suggestions from Benoit, from Fred Baker, and Dave Taylor, etc. And all these comments are highly appreciated. As we all know that there is lots of broadband access equipment in the IP network, but they need to configure IP address pools for these gateways, BNG and virtualized BNGs. But we all know that with the IPv4 address has been a valuable and scarce resource. The remaining IPv4 address has been scattered as small as /24 sometimes. And another problem is that it is complicated or complex to configure all the address pools in the IP network, since there's lots of network devices. For example, in China Telecom, we have more than 10,000 BNGs in our network. So manual configuration will be time-consuming and labor-intensive. And sometimes the address pools address block need to be moved from one device to another one to meet the instant requirements. And I think this, so we need to make the configuration automatic, coordinated. I think that's the same requirement. The requirement is the same for PGWs in mobile network. Another issue I should mention here is that once a address block is configured for a given network device, it will be announced to the routing entry will be announced to the public internet. The second use case is for address sharing among functions. This is a typical use case is for IPv6 transition scenarios, such as this night, network 406, which will be configured with IP address blocks for translated IP address to the public internet. For the high availability requirements, a separate address pools will be configured for each transition instance. So which in turn increase the number of IP address pools for the network. So this is the same to the use case one. If we configure the address pools for this transition instance manually, it will be complicated to configure all the address pools. So I think that's the same. The requirement is also the same for some other use cases. For example, SFC functions. The use case 3 is about NAT and CGN. CGN has been deployed in our network to improve IP address usage, and the NAT can be in the form of embedding components of network equipment, or it can be a standalone equipment in the network. So to improve the address usage, we need to configure the public address for each NAT device, available port range, and even the private public address mapping rules in the device. So it is quite complicated to configure all the work in this in the NAT. Sometimes we have the public address pools and to be translated from one NAT to another. So from our perspective, we think that we hope that the configuration of address pools in virtual BNGs, in BNGs, and in NAT can be automatic and coordinated. So this use case is about address configuration through the API of IPAM. So this use case is raised by Ian of Dutch Telecom. So Ian, please, would you give some introduction of this use case?
I'll talk from here if that's okay. Right, so this use case shows, well, in the previous use cases, we mainly had an IPAM type functionality configuring specific southbound elements. But what we're seeing increasingly is things like OpenStack controllers, SDN, other of these kind of things that are also responsible for configuring elements and virtual environments themselves. So the main point here really, which even I can't read from here, is the use of the IPAM as being a centralized resource and a central point of truth that a number of different things can hook into, and so having this kind of what's shown as an east-west interface between the IPAM, that resources can be taken from the IPAM on request. The element manager for the network management systems can update the IPAM with the allocations that it's made and the associated metadata that might be relevant for it.
Okay, thank you. The next one is about the case of RPKI. So,
okay. So what does the RPKI have to do with the IPAM? The RPKI is has been standardized by the CIDR working group at the IETF, and it enables IR holder to make a verifiable statement of its holding of the various resources. So if an IAM holder, typically an ISP, decide to employ ZRPK to safeguard its routing system, then ZRPK bears relevance to IPAM. So I work for a company that provide IPAM to large-scale enterprises. For example, the State Grid China, Petro China, if they decide to deploy ZRPK, the standardized interfaces will make life easier for us to provide in-house IPAM system. So looking at the ZRPK, I see two sorts of interfaces that the IPAM should provide. One is about the CA. If necessary, the IPv6 allocation will trigger the certificate issuance. And the other is about the local trust anchor as a relying party. For example, ISPs may want to establish a local view of the RPK while making use of the RPK data. That means the local trust anchor is needed. So the RPAM should let the relying party know what the local routing assertions. That helps to write the configuration of the local trust anchor. I'm going to ask you to share APLIX implementation.
Well, this is George Michelson from APNIC. I was going to raise that quality later on in the conversation. So I really only have a specific statement to this slide, but I'm happy to talk. But I think given you have a pack, you should present all of your pack. I don't want to barge in. But my specific observation here is that under final/8 address outcome, which applies particularly in the Asian and European region, many small blocks of address will not vest with the large provider that is nonetheless announcing them. Because the large provider has the large block, they cannot get more. So customers that are doing local content in virtual web hosting, telehousing, or maybe as a business and are bringing address in, you have to bear in mind they cannot be embedded in this system because the trust chain in certification stems through their keys in their certificates, not in your system. I like this model, but there will be boundaries of addresses that you wish to manage that cannot fit inside your IPAM, and you may have to offer configuration hints to them saying, wow, great, you want to be an RPKI? Do this. So you mean that you may need export notation to say this is the IPAM config that you should apply in your engine to do things. That was my comment to this point.
Thank you very much for the useful information.
Thank you, Dr. Ma. This use case about the IP address configuration management for SDN and NAV network. This is about some virtual machines VM creation and management by the OpenStack. When the virtual machine is initiated, the DHCP will be used to configure IP address for each virtual machines, and the controller, SDN controller, will also set up the overlay network between the virtual machine for their communication. However, that's enough because we need to configure the IP address port for DHCP agent in the OpenStack cloud. So in this case, SDN controller uses the IPAM for the IP address configurations for the DHCP agent. So in this case, maybe we need to define the interface between the SDN controller and the IPAM. Yeah, I have mentioned that this use case is raised by Junip, from the cache of Junip. Also, we give some questions for discussion today. This is it. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Any question on this presentation? We will have a discussion, 45-minute discussion, but if you have any question on this specific presentation before we move on. Okay. So, thank you. So now we're trying to do the remote. Rakesh, are you here?
You hear me?
Excellent.
Yes.
Mark, this is the latest the Mark just sent, right?
It should be. Is it?
Yep. Probably. My voice is echoing.
You
Is something I need to do, or is it good enough for everyone?
We could hear fine.
Okay.
Yeah, just tell us when to move the slides.
Yeah, you can move the slide right now. So like Mark said earlier, this is my take on what the challenges are, or what how the IPAM system is, and what we can do to improve that, and how it will benefit different use cases, industry, and stuff like that. And I just put together my vision of, if I have to build a brand new this address management system, how would I see that, and what the requirement would be. And some of those things I wanted to acknowledge that it's not that because it's like something I thought like came from me. I've been using AWS, and I'll be using other cloud service provider, and how easy it is to use them, and what kind of abstraction they give to use. I'm really inspired by them. So some of the credit goes to how cloud service providers are doing this. So can we go to the next slide? Yes. So what is IP address management? What the traditional approach is? Usually IP address management, at least the ones I have come across with, I'm pretty sure there are various implementations, various in the open source, which provide more degree of flexibility. And so usually there is not much of context, or very little context, like why IP address is needed, what is the user is going to do with the address, how it is associated with different contacts in the networking design, whether it's belong to switch, router, it's a transport interface, blah, 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 right? And the second thing is uncoordinated address pool management. What I mean by is there's a lack of single pane of glass. So let's say if you're a large enterprise and you want to allocate IP address, whatever you own that, whether it's a private or public, doesn't matter, right? So you might have a scheme where somebody might create a cheat sheet and allocate IP address based on the business unit or the application. And usually people create policy based on those fixed mapping. And as I said, there are different folks use different degree of flexibility. So I'm not saying that everyone has same implementation, but this overall theme. And the next thing is lack of built-in multi-tenancy. What I mean by is what I want to build a system where to the same address management system, different entity with different rollback model or ownership can come and use those interfaces to allocate the address space or allocate or manage the address space. And the next things which I've seen is, in my opinion, is, as I said, it's not across the board, but I've seen some place lack of integration with other address services. What I mean by, so let's say whenever we allocate IP address to an entity, whether it's a workload, whether it's a router, switch, or something, usually they don't automatically create DNS entry. Or let's say if you have a DSCP server sitting there and it's allocating IP address from a pool, there is not a single pane of glass where we could see, hey, what the allocation is at any given point of time, or how anybody is using those address. And the third thing comes to address translation. So just like in AWS, if somebody says that, hey, I want public address, private address, and automatically the address management system creates those entries. So that's what I mean by, this is what we see the IP address management system today. But as I'm repeating again one more time, I'm not saying that everybody is the same. There's a degree of flexibility, different folks do that. Any question, comments so far? Otherwise, we can move to the next slide. Yeah, so what exactly is our vision? Let's say if you have a brand new, we want to create it's a clean slate, what we should do is, so one of the things, like I said, that one of my experience where I'm inspired by the cloud service provider is, we should think about some kind of a metadata driven this address and address pool management. What I mean by is, let's say you want to allocate an IP address, and instead of saying, hey, just give me IP for address, public or private, I want to say that, hey, who you are, what kind of element you are, tell me a little bit about more, associate some context, maybe tell me what exactly you want to use the address space for that, and tell me your need. then I will do a lot of those things, which right now people do with the multiple different interfaces or multiple different API, right? And the second thing I would like to have let's say if a large organization want to use those IP address pool, let's say if you're a service provider and you have managed service, you have 3GPP or you have BNG or whatnot services, you have that. I would like that there's a central pool from where the IP addresses could be either managed, allocated, and there is a single pane of glass where somebody could see that, hey, this is my resource utilization across the entire organization, who is using, how is he using, what my network look like with this IP address, right? And the third thing is we'd like to create an address management system which can meet wide variety of use cases. And when I say wide variety of the use cases, context is different to different folks. When I say wide variety of use case, what I mean is everybody who does some network or network operation, they know they have to manage in a data center or branch or campus all different kind of network element, whether they're physical or if they're virtual because of private cloud, and they're different kind of endpoint servers, then their services run on top of this one, right? Like could be BNG, 3GPP. So when I talk about single solution, I don't mean try to categorize enterprise, service provider, BNG, 3GPP. What I'm trying to say is anybody who is looking for managing address space, we should look at it as a complete solution. And the last thing is that we want to make sure that we should be able to integrate automatically this IPAM or the new address management system with the other addressing system. Could be NAT, or let's say if you want to allocate public IP address and you want to create a mapping, maybe we want to create a fixed mapping. Or if you wanted to, understand what the DHCP server is doing, how it's managing the IP address, bring the interface with that. So, and if you want to create automatically a DNS entry based on some algorithm or the logic which is given by a organization, we can automatically do that. So this is the vision I have at the very top level, where we think a new system should be able to model after what other folks are doing in the cloud service provider. Any question, comments so far? So Mark, we can move to next slide. Yeah, so I tried to take a shot at what these interface could be, what those requirements would be. So like I was trying to allude earlier, that when we're trying to, let's say we want to allocate an IP address. So instead of saying, hey, give me IPv4, IPv6 address or private or public, let's assume we have some kind of a mechanism to impart like a more attribute, just like a DHCP server. A DHCP client can give additional attribute and the DHCP servers can respond back, filling those attributes if there's more information needed, right? So we could ask for, hey, are you switch, router, firewall, server, endpoint? I mean, this is just a thought process. I'm not saying this is how it should be done. I'm just creating here so that people think about when I talk about metadata, what that means. Or we could say that, hey, I want to understand what form factor you're running. Are you a virtual element or a physical element? What your interface attributes are? Are you a transit interface? Are you endpoint? Or your interface managed only for managing perspective? And then the second thing is what network segment identifier belong to. Let's say VLAN. Let's say I want to allocate an IP address, and if I know which network segment it belongs to, and I can automatically create an IP address. I know DHCP server and client do that, but this kind of model does not exist in the other things which I'll present later on. And the second and the next thing is network segment type. Maybe it's a point-to-point interface, maybe it's a multi-point interface, maybe I have a different policy how I allocate IP address in point-to-point or multi-point network. And then the addressing scope, just like in AWS, you want to, if I create a workload, I can tell that I want private address, I want public address, it automatically does everything. So I can give them the addressing scope. Next thing is address request type, right? Do I want a fully qualified IP address if it is a IP for 32-bit, or maybe I need a block size for whatever reason. And the next thing is tenant identification, so that I can implement multi-tenancy from the same system. And ability to define new and custom attribute. If the attribute we discuss, they are not good enough. So this is the overall theme. I'm not trying to say that we have to do this thing, but this is the direction I hope we go there, where we create more of an abstraction and not go into specific of exactly how an IP address could be allocated. That could be driven by policy. Mark, should I just keep on moving, or like?
Please continue.
Okay, so next slide. Yeah, the next thing is interface address pool management. Like we discussed earlier, we wanted to also define an interface where an entity could create multiple address pools. So let's say I'm an enterprise and I own both legacy data center and the private cloud. So I want to maybe have a different pools. So if the SDN controller want to allocate IP address, I want to give them from different pool than the one which I want to give it to legacy data center. Or maybe I want to have, I'm allocating IP address for the remote locations like branches and campus, and I want to use different set of address pools. Or maybe they're different business entity within an organization, they want to have their own pools, they have been pre-allocated, and maybe they want to define that, right? So we should support those kind of interface where user could create these pools and create other association with, hey, for this particular pool, I want to make sure lease is this much, or I want to define allocation priority in which this if there are multiple pools belong to same entity, which pool would you use, or the different mapping scheme, how an IP address would be allocated. And the second thing is journal requirement for interface definition, like multi-tenancy, authentication, security. This is, in my opinion, across the board. Doesn't matter what interface you develop, because your IP address management system could very well sit in the cloud. Let's say if I'm an organization, I have a remote branch, campus, and all my data center have moved to the cloud. So maybe I'll deploy my address management somewhere else. So we really should think about authentication, security as fundamental building block of any interface development. And the last thing, but not least, what I alluded earlier was we should be able to integrate with other management service. Like when a DHCP server comes up, how do you allocate its pool? Do I statically configure that? Or maybe DHCP server based on which domain it belongs to automatically get its pool. And same thing with net pool, DNS mapping, and the address interoperability. If somebody wants to create, they want to create a workload and application, and they want to assign both IPv4, IPv6 address. So we need to make sure that whatever entry we need to create for seamless access from, let's say, IPv6 client want to access IPv4 server, whatever those entries we need to create, maybe we can automatically create. So going to the next slide, Mark. So this is the overall vision, and the way I created this vision was a little bit different than Dr. Shi presented. To be honest with you, like I said earlier, to me, IP address allocation is central to any network operation, whether they are branch, campus, legacy, or they're private cloud, public cloud. Doesn't matter, those network operate 3GPP or BNG, or they operate enterprise application. No matter what services you're running top, everybody needs to manage large scale network. And because of virtualization, there's a lot of complexity as the workload are moving different environment. Maybe you want to reallocate IP address if the workload moving different environment, or whatever you want to do. So I'm looking at address management system not from a use case like BNG or NAT or something, but as a holistic approach. SDN controller need, legacy network need. When I say legacy network need, in the past, folks have been designing networks. Sometimes small service provider or small enterprise, you just need like an Excel spreadsheet, and they give you IP addresses. Like I said, whether public or private, maybe they give it to infrastructure or applications, and somebody just keep track of it, right? And sometimes people have some kind of policy in the OSS BSS, which gives an interface to the other system, which can allocate IP address from IPAN. And the last but not least, what we mean by admin is, a lot of times I've seen the small company, they statically allocate IP addresses and they assign those IP addresses for whatever reason. So when I say admin interfaces, somebody can request an IP address. So right now it's done. Those basically is a completely like a cheat sheet or Excel spreadsheet and somebody keeping track of. I don't want that. I want everybody to have single pane of glass and visibility. Doesn't matter whoever is the user, whether it's a controller or whether these are script or these are legacy network or the admin wants to use allocate IP address. Doesn't matter who the user is. Everybody should go to the same address management system. And below there, I see address helper function, which can help us integrate with different addressing system. And as I said, these are the things which I've seen a lot of cloud service provider do that. I'm not saying this is a whole list. This is just idea I had put together. And what I'm trying to propose in this working group with the green color arrows, these are the interface we work in this group. Interface for managing address space and the pools. Interface for helper functions, managing address records. Let's say if we wanted to initiate and configure DHCP server pool, or I want to receive all the address record from the DHCP server. And the third interface, which I have in mind, is interface for logs, so that some higher system can extract all this information and you can create a topology and the address map. And somebody can look at their entire network, who's using what IP address, what the resources, how much has been used, and who's using what they're doing and stuff like that. So I think that's all I have to say. Any questions, comments?
Oh, this is Will. This is Will Liu from Huawei. So here is some clarifying questions. First of all, could you please go to the back last slide? Yeah. So here you wrote. Oh, I hear a lot of noise. So here you wrote DNS mapping. Could you please do more explanation on this function?
So when I say DNS mapping, let's say my SDN controller created a workload based on the application I want to orchestrate, right? So right now, I can automatically create DNS mapping and publish the DNS mapping. That's what I mean to say. So right now, what I've seen is in the AWS cloud, when I launch a workload, Amazon has a way to create private DNS mapping and the public DNS mapping. And I don't know whether Amazon allows you to configure an attribute, what the DNS record look like. So when I said DNS mapping, mean an enterprise could say that these are the attributes, this is how you generate a DNS mapping, and here is my, let's say, DNS server, maybe you can update the entry. That's what I mean.
Okay, could you please go to the next slide? So for this figure, I see that this figure is a little bit different from the one in the draft. So the key issue here is that you wrote a legacy network on the top of the address space management system. But on the other side, it's OSS and admin. So it's like they belong to different categories. So what do you mean by here, the legacy networks?
So what I mean by is, so I'll tell you what, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Will, you're right. There is one difference in the picture, which I said it on the email thread. I think I was seeing what Dr. Shi was saying from BNG and how different folks are using this, right? So what I put is, I put this enterprise service provider on top. So when I say legacy network, what I mean by is, let's say you have a data center or branch of campus. Let's say you deploy some application in branch, or let's say you want to give IP address to your laptop or users, right? So a lot of times, some folks do some scripting or some proprietary mechanism to allocate those IP addresses. So when I say legacy network is, whatever your model is for allocating those IP address, that's what I'm representing by this bullet. And when I say OSS, BSS, sometimes it could be that, hey, the OSS, BSS could provide some interfaces to IP address management for higher entity. And I don't know whether folks do that based on whatever I've seen OSS, BSS, I get put that. So OSS, BSS, I think it's possible, but I'm not 100% sure. But legacy network, I'm pretty sure how a lot of entities do that. Will, any more clarification?
One more question will be that on the right-hand side, so you wrote the interface for logs, the DHCP, DNS. So actually here, it might be confusing. I'm not sure whether people can see clearly here. So the words in the green color, so there are DHCP and the DNS net, but on it, I mean, at the bottom of this figure, there are also NAT, DHCP server, and so it seems that the same function blocks here appears twice in the same figure. So you might need to explain more on this, because in my opinion, they belong to different scenarios and different use. Right?
So Will, what I'm trying to say here is, maybe I think I can provide you clarification, then maybe we can change the figure. So think about it. Let's say you are an enterprise. Like I said earlier, you have given these different pools and you have provided all this proprietary, whatever the algorithm, how to allocate IP address, right? But I want a single pane of glass where I can extract all the information. So when I'm talking about that interface, I'm saying that interface will provide me the complete visibility from everything below. So the interface below is to actually pull all the information from this address management system like DSCP. And the interface above there, the green arrow, that is to pull all the record from a single interface or API. So think like that. You have a single pane of glass, single like truth, where you have all the information about anything related to addressing.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, this is Jeff Oz. Could you please return to requirements 1 of 2?
Just,
I'm sorry.
It's like 3 slides up, I think.
just one slide.
Oh, is it just one slide?
Yeah. Just go one.
There.
Requirements 1 of 2.
Okay, so I have an observation under addressing scope. Addressing scope is actually a very nice idea because it allows you to figure out whether address resources might be internal, external, or some interesting blend. The thing I would suggest is missing from the requirements is some sort of grouping identifier, because to give a specific example, but this is not the only one, in a VPN, you may require some number of blocks of VPN addresses, for purpose of use within the VPN. They all are related to each other, but if they don't have some sort of way to tie those together, it's not possible in the address manager to tell that relationship may exist.
No, you're right. So that's why I try to put that we can define custom attributes and so that we would like I'm not sure we can define everything, and of course we should amend based on, like you said, the different use cases. But I still want the ability to create custom attributes. I hopefully that could answer.
It gives you that room. My suggestion would be for your first pass of this, that a grouping mechanism of some sort, whether you call it a grouping ID, a community, pick something, whatever it may be, that provides that collection activity should be part of the first end of the spec. Because if you try to do it after the fact, it becomes harder.
Yeah, somebody can take the comment who's will take it. I think it's a good idea.
Ian Farrer, can you go back to the diagram slide? I think it's 2 slides on, or 3 slides on. So a few more clarification questions on this one, I think. You've got the address space management system in the center, but I'm not entirely sure what your basis for saying that an SDN controller belongs above that, but say a DHCP server belongs below that. I mean, as I see this, these are all consumers and allocators of IP addressing resources in their own right. And so I don't see what the basis for the differentiation is there. Secondly, when we start to talk to the elements southbound from the address space management, surely these are all bidirectional interfaces as well. I mean, the DHCP server makes an allocation, it maintains that, it collects some relevant information from the client. It may have static configuration and those kind of things in there. This is stuff that needs to be fed northbound into the address space management to achieve this single point of truth that you're talking about. So for me, I think this would make a lot more sense if we kind of put consumers of the information, devices that will provide either be configured or do a further layer of address configuration below that, and then the northbound interfaces into the logging and whatever infrastructure that's required for the management of that functionality.
No, good comment. Just to respond to that, when I put this top down, I don't mean necessarily that between a relationship, and I would be very open to working with you to see what you exactly have in mind. And you're right, these are not, pardon me for the picture incorrectness. I'm not trying to say these are not bidirectional. So, I mean, you're right, this picture needs to be fixed, but I would like to take your view. Maybe you can help me and maybe we can understand each other.
Yep, sure. Yeah, another question, the address helper plugins, do you have an idea of how those are implemented? Are they part of the address space management system, or is this another entity, or is this something that exists in the elements themselves?
Suddenly your voice is very low. I don't know, it's on my end, but I'll respond. I think I heard your question.
I can repeat it if you like.
No, I heard your question, but can you guys hear me or no? I'm not sure whether the problem is my side.
No, we can hear you fine, yeah.
Okay, so I'll tell you my view of what this should be. So just based on practicality, let's say I have a DSCP server, and DSCP server is already implemented, it's deployed in the network, right? So the question is, let's say if we define this new address management system, how do I interact with the DSCP server so I can initialize the pool and I can extract the information which I want? Just like you said, these are bidirectional interface. So my opinion would be we cannot boil the ocean. We cannot go and change the DSCP specification. So the right way to do is somebody develop a plugin, right? And the question is where the plugin writes. So one could say that, hey, what I could do is I could write that, let's say a DSCP server vendor could provide me a plugin and they could consume this southbound and northbound interfaces from the address management system. Suddenly, that vendor DSCP server can integrate with address management system. That's model number one, right? That's one way it could work. And the second way, in my opinion, is where we could do is that we provide those standard plugins as part of the address management system, where we know how DSC server operate or how a net system operate. But I would kind of resist that temptation because some things have been defined in the standard and some things are not defined in the standard. So my strict opinion where things are more practical would be that we publish these interfaces, what I'm calling these green arrows, and then let each DSCP server vendor or some third party provide those interfaces. This is my opinion.
Okay. Yeah, it looks like one of those kind of devils in the implementation kind of things that's, yeah, the ability, well, you know, but my personal preference here is to say, well, however that's achieved, if we can do this using a netconf interface and we can get this in the elements ourselves, then, you know, this is the closest way of getting it there. And this extra layers of abstraction tend to complicate and actually reduce the functionality that's available. Just my opinion there.
No, you're right. You're right. So what we could do as a part of this working group, we could say that these green arrow could be satisfied with the existing framework. That would be great. If it serves the purpose, we should use the existing mechanisms.
Okay, quick, go ahead.
Hello, it's George Karagiannis from Huawei. Actually, I agree with the previous comments that this architecture needs somehow, say, restructuring, and in a way that, you know, you have the northbound interface, southbound interface, and then the address space management in the system. So maybe you can work that out. That's one comment, and the other comment is related to some activities that are being done in the broadband forum, the BBF. I'm also active in BBF, particularly in a project that is called the Cloud Central Office, and there we are decomposing and virtualizing the BNG, and there, of course, when you virtualize the BNG, one part of the virtualized BNG is also related to address management. So the address management will be somehow part of a component that will be virtualized. And it will be also good to have a way on how it could dynamically, manage the pools that will be used in this virtualized, say, parts of the BNG. So I think that will be an important part that could also be communicated with broadband forum.
Yes, thank you, Georges. Next presentation, Jen. He's gone. Okay, so as I right, you have to kill this. Like that much. Go full screen. Okay. Click. Yeah. Okay. So this presentation is, since I read it a bit, is to again take the different boxes of the architecture and then go into each use case But I'm not sure I want to speak for the speaker. It's coming.
Sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chen Li from China Telecom. This presentation is about the Casm's architecture. The overall architecture of Casm system that Rakesh has presented just now. And according to our discussion yesterday, we plan to divide our works to two phases. Phase one is about how to do the whole work of address management, and include the southbound interface of Casm to the devices. And the interface is for helping functions to create and access reports. And in phase one, there is a northbound interface for managing address space and ports. And in our plans, the phase two is about the Casm interface to the third parties. The interface is for checking or notify logs and DHCP, DNS, NAT, address allocation records.
You want us to move the slide?
This slide is about the workflow for BNG use case. We specified the workflow for this case into several parts. One is BNG initials address port request for desired size of address, and the management system allocates address port and reply the BNG. And the BNG issues a renewal request if the lifetime is going to expire. And then the BNG keeps monitoring and reports the current usage of the current address ports. This slide is about the workflow for public IP ports in NAT or CGN functions use case. We specify the workflows with several parts. One is allocate the public IP address ports on NAT devices and release the free public IP address ports. And public IP address port includes some functions about public IP address ports, port stack, and translation policy configuration. The general property of this use case is include private and public IP address, and NAT mapping rules include static or dynamics mappings. This slide is about the workflow for cloud enterprise use case. We specify it as the Casm management system configure the IP address ports on the DHCP or virtual DHCP for LAN side of CPE. And the management system configure the IP address ports on the DHCP or virtual DHCP for the one side of CPEs. And the management system also configure the IP address ports of DHCP for virtual machines in the data centers. To manage the public IP address resource effectively and avoid the manual configuration mechanism. This is a workflow for DHCP v4 use case. The specify is an address-based management system used to initialize multiple address ports on DHCP servers for hosts and configure DHCP statically. If the DHCP server is ever replaced, the new server must be configured with the same old port. This is the workflow for DHCP v6 delegation use case. The specify is management system configure the IPv6 prefix for CPE on DHCP v6 server. The DHCP v6 server then assign the corresponding IPv6 prefix to CPE. Another workflow for IPAM use case, the managing address ports include private and public IP address and allocation schemes, mapping addresses to requirements, and allocation priorities. It is order in which ports are considered, and leave duration for each port, and port fragmentation rules. It means how port can be subdivided. And the general property of this use case include multi-tenants and authentication and security. And then include query available and allocated resources, and the notification when a resource depletion, the threshold is reached. This is other workflow of the use case. Thank you.
Thank you. Any question on this presentation before we start the discussion, the generic discussion?
Yes, please. Benoit Claire speaking. Can you go back on slide number 3? On this one, so you want the BNG to initiate the address pool request, while the other use cases, the Casm system there was directly telling what the prefix is. Is this something that you want? Like the BNG initiate the address pool request? Because then we go into a more autonomic networking type of things, right? Where the device themselves request what they need, which is different.
I think the BNGs can report their usage of IP addresses to the Casm, and Casm also can, according to the usage of the BNGs, to decide whether to allocate the IP address to the BNGs.
So there is a big distinction between reporting the usage for this Casm system to take a decision, or having the BNG telling I need this prefix, and I'm trying to understand which one you want.
I think both of them we can do it.
Mike Ackerman, just a quick question. I assume that the intent here is to fully support IPv6, and I'm just wondering why I didn't see the word Slack up here at all. You might want to include that. That makes sense.
Maglash, I have a sub-question to your question. You mean by having policies somewhere that defines
It's
Slack or
another
not?
method for doling out addresses, and I didn't see it on any chart anywhere.
If it only works on 4, it's broken. So I do not wish to dominate the conversation in the room. And I think my problem and my addition to this room is maybe a 10% problem. So this conversation is about 80–90% of a real problem. How do I build definition for a huge network plan that is a dynamic system? How do I automate? And this is a good story. I like the story. I think you are all the presenters have brought to the room qualities that have a unifying element. You want a syntax, you want formalisms, you want structure, you want commonality. I think we would all love this. So here is my 10%, which is not on any of your packs. It's not meant to dominate, it's just an observation. All of this conversation has assumed something that I would call ground truth. The ground truth is the things you think you have. So the resources you think you have. And nowhere in this conversation have you said, how do I find what I have? Which suggests you think you are still manually saying, I have control of net 10. I have 127/8. It's as if you believe that your definitional space is that you say what you have. And so I am here to say there is a conversation which is above your north. You are talking about systems asking north, and I am sitting above your north saying, I would like to talk to you about questions you can ask me. That I and other agencies like me want to talk to you. How do we give you information that can become useful to you for things like RPKI? And how do you give us information for things like reverse DNS or customer more specific address details or engagement in process with law enforcement or a number of conversations? But truly, this is 10%. Your conversation is 80–90% facing down. I think it is a good conversation.
Thank you, ma'am.
Brian Carpenter. I'm really coming back a little bit to Benoit's question and what he hinted at. As you know, I got you to change the word centralized to the word coordinated for a specific reason. I think some of these questions, like the one he was asking, are actually more easily solved and more correctly solved in a distributed solution. Now, the buzzword of the week for the distributed solution is autonomic networking, but that's only a buzzword. I think the principle to establish is that it is in order for an agent somewhere down in the network to take the initiative of deciding that it needs a prefix or 10 and sending them, or alternatively deciding that it no longer needs a prefix or 10 and returning them to a pool. The pool itself can be distributed in the way I'm thinking. The pool doesn't have to be all in one place either. The thing that you probably have to collect centrally is information you need for reporting and tracking abuse, right? That's probably impossible to avoid sending that up to some central place. But a lot of the interactions you describe, and the ones for the broadband subscriber interfaces as well, which I haven't seen on any of your slides, they can be distributed. The pool can be distributed. Once you've got your pool from George using the third protocol that he just invented, the pool itself can be distributed through the network. All I'm saying is your square there, Casm system, is not monolithic. It doesn't need to be monolithic. I think your view of the northbound and southbound protocols is correct. I have a candidate for the southbound protocol, but that's a detail. But just bear in mind that distribution is the way to handle problems of extremely large scale. And when we get to IPv6, where you could be generating virtual networks by the million very easily, you have an enormous problem of scale, and distributing the problem probably makes it easier. End of rant.
Thank you.
Brian, can I ask you a quick question? This is Rakesh.
Yeah, Rakesh, I'm back on the microphone.
Yeah, so I think I just wanted to have this chat on the centralization and coordination, and I'll tell you how I look at it. And sometimes I don't know it's a terminology. I'll give an example. let's say I'm creating a management system, and let's take it the virtual network, right? So let's say I have my SDN controller, and let's say I have multiple private data center. Let's say there's a SDN controller sitting in each data center, right? So I have multiple SDN controller, and they are coordinating end-to-end workflow. So there is some higher level orchestration even, which makes sure end-to-end service is delivered no matter where the workload is sitting in the what you call that in the private data center. So you can call that coordinated. But let me just flip it a little bit. Let's say tomorrow I build a highly scalable engine and I deploy my SDN controller in the AWS cloud, and I can manage all those hundreds of private data center with a single interface I provide to the north of me, what George was saying or somebody else was saying. So to be honest with you, this centralization coordination to some extent, to me, it become an implementation detail. What, in my opinion, what I was trying to say is how a logical entity is going to operate northbound and southbound. You can call that distributed, coordinated, centralization. Different folks will look at different ways. What is your opinion?
Yeah, I think we agree violently, actually. But, you know, until you come with a concrete proposal, we can't be certain that we agree violently. But I think I agree. I mean, if you take the example of building basically a virtual private network with SDN, it needs a bunch of addresses. So one agent somewhere in the network could go and look for all the addresses that virtual private network needs, and it could return them 3 days later. So whether you call that centralized or distributed is kind of not important.
Correct. So that's what the reason I brought this up is, do you think coordinated everybody feels? Because I don't want to make sure coordinated becomes one implementation detail. So if let's say if I'm the vendor, I would say coordinated, what you're telling me is don't develop a cloud-based model where I can manage everything. So I don't want it to become an implementation specific thing.
Yep, I agree. But that still means that the southbound protocol is important for a multi-vendor situation.
No, I agree with you. I completely agree with you. I'm not denying that. So all I was trying to say is, here is what I was trying to say. Do we want to call some other name centralized, coordinated, because it has different connotation to different folks?
Yep, I agree. I'm leaving the microphone because there's a whole queue behind me.
Okay.
Bernie Volz. This is just a follow-up on Benoit's question, you know, about that slide. And one of the things was that you say on there, you know, the desired pool size. And how does the BNG or any device know what that desired pool size is? And so, you know, it begins to mean that now you're going to get some policy there or something like that. And so, you know, it's just the scope begins to grow pretty quick when you start doing some of that stuff. You know, it may be that you just want to have somebody has to, you know, or some OSS system has to provision something, and then the device can just go and say, okay, what is my configuration? You know, there might be places to start out that are a little bit easier than trying to build all that policy engine or that knowledge into the Casm system itself, right, or that central management system at this point.
Thank you.
Eric Nordmark. So I'm trying to tease apart sort of some architectural picture out of this thing. So I have two sort of inquiries in this space. So one is sort of who's driving the bus, right? Is the model here that the Casm system itself owns the IP address pool and somehow gets it? And people request space in that pool, as opposed to the Casm system handing it out because it's somehow told through some configuration that I believe this BNG needs this much and this DHCP server needs this much, right? It's not clear to me from the discussion we had so far how this thing is intended to work, right? You couldn't have the completely request driven that, you know, someone at the bottom is requesting space, right? And then reporting back usage and whatever. Or you can have the more, I'm going to drive out some configuration because I have a more centralized controller view that can see the occupancy rate, you know, the usage patterns across all of these clients underneath, and basically give them what it thinks they need, or take it away when some more important user comes around, right? So that part of the picture isn't clear to me. I don't expect people to answer this now, but just think about it. The other one was, I can't really tell from these two APIs, the northbound and southbound, plus the one that George was referring to, whether they're really distinct APIs or whether they're just different layers in the stack in which you more or less say the same thing, right? Because if you have a notion that, well, I want to be able to find out usage, well, you want to find out usage from a DHCP server. Does it mean that it's also useful to report that northbound, saying, here's my aggregate usage? Meaning these are just different expressions of the same, or it's the same protocol that you can use both northbound and southbound, right? Maybe with some extensions if you need additional features. There isn't enough detail here for at least me to be able to understand whether that's the case, or these are completely distinct protocols, right? The northbound and southbound. So that's something for people to think about.
Mark, can I respond to this?
Please.
Yeah, so having
Go ahead, Kish.
yeah, so to the first one, whether the two questions were raised, whether we have thought about that, about these interfaces where the beginning truth comes from. So of course, we have not put that level of detail there. This is my take on this one. So no matter what system you develop, addressing system, any system, right? You need to have some information for the system to bootstrap. So I will call that, like, you have to bootstrap the system. So the question is what you need to bootstrap this Casm system. So I would say that, in my opinion, in order to keep the scope very limited and simple, somebody has to analyze, allocate when the system come up, what those different address pools are, what those, if you want to define policy for this address pool, how the address pool would use, like which I presented in my presentation. So you could bring the system up where the system is ready for the consumer to consume information, right? So that is number one. Second thing, in my opinion, is whether these interfaces are distinct or they are same, there has to be some level of difference in northbound and southbound, because what we want to do is northbound become more user-friendly and more user-centric kind of interface. Just like I was telling you, when I was using the AWS, I really like their interface. And the second set of interface, when I was talking about the southbound, is which interact with different address mapping system like DHCP. So they may, our intent is not to make them like a user-friendly just northbound. So in my opinion, there would be some difference between northbound and southbound. But of course, devil is in the detail. Unless we put those requirements, we don't know what the difference is between two interfaces. That's all, Mark.
Okay. This is Mark Townsley here talking. We had a name collision problem there a moment ago between Mark the chair and Mark me at the mic. I just wanted to call attention to, I haven't seen it referenced, so maybe the people here are unaware of RFC 7695, if I've got that correct. It's a distributed prefix distribution assignment, prefix assignment algorithm that was developed in the home networking group, which was dealing with this problem of how do I take a prefix and distribute it amongst the various links in a home network in a distributed manner, and do it in a provably correct manner, dealing with the collisions, et cetera, et cetera. But we carved that out and made sure that it would apply in various other situations. So 7695 is its own thing. It's a proven, and I mean mathematically proven algorithm that does this distributed prefix assignment, which is sometimes tricky. And there's a lot of good work behind it. And I would highly recommend looking at it, particularly if we dial this centralized versus distributed a little bit over towards distributed. That's all.
Sorry, I think we're cutting the lines because we're 15 minutes. So depending on, no, please go ahead, cutting after George.
Okay, I'm Chung Feng of Telecom. I try to answer the question of Benoit's. Yes, there are two approaches for address allocation, address block allocation and reallocations. One is that based on the CAS server will decide based on the report from the device. Another one is that the device will ask for address resource. Right now, we have implemented a prototype system based on the approach 1, and it has been supported by 3 vendors, and we also has implemented the field trial in our network, and it proved that this current approach can work for the for this address allocation problem well. Thank you.
So Warren Kamari, I'm still not convinced. I mean, if I'm deploying something like a router, the address space is a really tiny part of deploying something like a router. There's so much other information that I need that the address management part is really simple. If I'm deploying something like a BRAS or BNG or DHCP pool, I'm presumably doing that because I have users or customers or something similar. And I should have a rough idea of how many there are. And if I chose the wrong size pool when I did it, well, that was stupid. I should make it bigger, right? That shouldn't happen that often to me, right? If I'm deploying stuff, you can't guess how many users you've got, you have other issues. And if I'm deploying something like a big virtual cloud type thing, I have so much other proprietary stuff that presumably my address management stuff is tied into all of that other proprietary stuff, and I don't need a standardized way for that either. So I'm still not convinced, but George sounds like he's got strong views.
Thank you. My name is Ying Cheng from China Unicom. After reviewing the slides and the draft for this work, I found that most use cases and architecture work focuses on the IP fixed network. So is it possible to extend the scope to involve the mobile network as the next step of the further work?
I think it is yes.
Can Mark here, could you describe what is missing or what needs for mobile networks? Could you describe a little bit more what is missing? Okay. So the answer was that person will write on the mailing list.
So if there is someone who wants to talk, what I have to say isn't so important. You should cut the line at me. If someone wants to be up here, I can stand down. But I'm happy to take the last slot. So we have people from LACNIC in the room. We have Augustin and Chisho from LACNIC. And we have Miriam from Wright in the room, and I am from APNIC. And collectively, we are all trying to understand IPAM. Because individually, we receive requests from IPAM builders who say to us, hey, I know I have to do operations in you to register information. I need to do reverse DNS. I need to get a customer to apply through you for a small block of address that will be theirs. I need to do RPKI. We know this is a question coming our way. And we are inventing things, and inventing things is always dangerous. So we have decided to invent this thing called OpenID. It's amazing technology, and big companies have come up with a way to use this to do like large federated identity management. So we thought, wow, let's invent that. So we did. And we've invented this thing called JSON. So we're doing all our data structures across these boundaries using things like JSON. And it's amazing. There are these other people who have simultaneously invented JSON. And we've invented this thing called REST, where you do simple queries in the web with your OpenAuth ID and an API token, and you get back JSON. And amazingly enough, a lot of other companies have invented this. And we feel like maybe we could stop inventing things and we could just use industry standard software development for doing machine-to-machine communication over trusted channels. And I think it will work, but we need to talk to people who are writing IPAM software. I know it is only maybe 10% of your problem, but this ground truth problem is actually quite big for us. So if you want to be part of a bigger whole, please talk to us about how we can talk to you about the communications that go north. The architecture of the South stuff, I don't think we have a role talking in that. We don't understand how people do the administration. And Warren, I didn't mean to disrespect your skepticism, because I think there are reasons to say real ISPs with huge billion-dollar investments know what they're doing. But we increasingly now talk to people who are virtual network operators, who maybe take lease of layer 2, and they don't know what they're doing. And we need you to write this software so that they can configure their virtual BNG, their virtual DSLAM, their virtual construction properly. We need this. And I know there are smart people in China, in CNNIC, doing software development work in this space, doing work in RPKI. We value that immensely. So please do keep this work on. Please do.
Thank you, George. So are we expecting a draft from the IRR describing your requirements and what you got?
We are inching towards thinking about how to invent a conversation. Yeah.
So these questions on the slide right now are the ones that were floating around, some from the ADs. So one thing we need to achieve here is what's the next steps, and I'm not sure we have answered those questions. I'm looking at the people who asked those questions, if they got their answers.
So Benoit Claes speaking. So I was the one asking the first question there, which interfaces does Casm plan on standardizing? I've seen multiple figures here. I've seen, and I'm not sure which one we're talking about. I've seen multiple arrows, some going from, you know, the north southbound to the northbound to the Casm. I've seen arrows going from the northbound interface. And, you know, this is still what I'm missing, that, you know, maybe this group should be focusing on one figure with the building blocks that they need, and somehow the flow for the use cases, right? And think carefully what the flow is, because if we go into the distributed approach, there are a lot of consequences, right? So the scope is bigger. This is still what I'm missing. And you know, I observe that we spend quite some time on those figures because there are still things that are unclear, maybe just to me, right? And that's fine. So to answer your question, I don't believe that I've got the answer here on the first answer. Now, that could be fine because it's a non-working forming buff, right? It's difficult to evaluate what a success is for such a buff. Maybe it's just that people speak together, and then we'll have a nice draft in a month from now, including the multiple operators we've seen here discussing, IR also discussing. So maybe this is a good buff, right? And the second question is almost the same, right? In this diagram, which are in the interfaces? Which are new protocols or not? Because the last comment there about REST and JSON, I agree. I mean, in the end, it's about data models, right? Which are defining the interfaces. Because in my mind, I see a data model as an API. And whether we use REST or with JSON or NetConf with XML, I mean, yes, there are differences, but they're minor. And on the third question, since I'm here, right? Yeah, I've seen like the vision there, which is like a very long list of everything, the full IPAM, the full one. So maybe you want to have like a more phased approach or something like that, and carefully think about what needs to be interoperable, right? Or you're just here to say, we're going to develop the full IPAM system with all the interfaces to all the components. But again, I need guidance from you. I'm not the one working on this, right? You have to tell us. And I stop here. Okay.
Just asking for more.
Yeah, please.
Any other questions, any other comments on these specific questions?
Okay. We're 5 minutes left. Maybe what we could do is try to see if the first question or the first bullet up there has, some traction. Do you think, so we'll do a do you think there's a problem that needs solving and that the IETF is the right group to attempt solving it? Please if you agree. Please if you disagree. Okay. I'm not sure we have this. Is the scope well defined and understood? Let's try this one.
No. Let's try this.
Okay.
Willing to work on the problem. I
Oh,
think that's
okay.
really important.
Okay. Please raise your hand if you are willing to work on the problem. 10, 12, 15-ish.
Yeah, and I'm trying to see a variety of organizations represented. It's not just the original core folks. Oh, okay, yeah. Good question. So, raise your hand if you're a vendor of similar systems that's willing to work on this. Okay. And if you're an operator that would be willing to work on it. Good. And, another category?
Ridge Street. Yes, Warren?
So for the second one, we saw there were a bunch of people willing to work on it, but could we also break that down by people who are willing to actually write drafts versus just, I'm interested and want to do something?
I'm not sure at this time. If we were going a working group, forming both, then we would be reaching that level, but I'm not sure there's.
Okay. Then on the third question, is the scope of the question well defined and understood? And if so we'll take a yes and no, and if you do no, if we could take a second on the mailing list to get a response about what needs to be better defined. So let's try this if you think that the scope of the problem is well defined and understood, now. Okay, if you think that the scope of the problem is not well defined and not well understood, now. Okay, so it sounds like we need some work on the mailing list to get a better definition of the problem. I think we're done. And I think so, yeah.
Unless
this is Andrew Sullivan. Could I just ask one additional question? Ask the chairs to do this. Whether you think that the problem is not well understood yet, but there's a hope of actually getting there.
Yes. Okay.
Well,
yeah.
I'm not sure about this one.
So if you thought that the problem is not well understood, but you think we have a path to getting to be well understood, now. If you think it's not well understood and we're not going to be able to understand it, now. Great. Thank you, Andrew.
Final comments before we close the meeting. We're
just about right on time.
Just about
2 minutes
on time.
early.
Thank you very much.
Okay, yes, thank you.
Have a nice day. Blue sheets, please.
Wow. Asians. How are you doing? Good. How are you? Yeah. How about you?
Yeah, no, it's just you. Yeah, but I've been, so I've been concentrating. I'm the administration.